You're listening to Radio Sri Lanka. Very good morning to you. It's precisely around 13 minutes past the hour of 7, and it's time for the coffee hour. And we have with us the Commissioner at the Human Rights Commission of Sri Lanka and Research Fellow at the University of Oxford, Dr. Gehan Gunatilleke this morning. A very good morning to you, Doctor.
Good morning, good morning.
And it's amazing to have you here with us on Coffee Hour this morning.
Yeah, pleasure to be on the show.
Right, so today we're going to talk all about human rights. So in a layman's point of view, can you explain what human rights is? I mean, the name itself says it all, but I'm pretty sure you'll have a better explanation.
Yeah, okay, so let's start with the question of what is a right. So right is essentially something that is so important, an interest that is so important that a society recognizes that others should have duties towards you. So, for example, my interest in expressing myself is so important that societies will recognize that others have a duty to allow me to speak. And that's what you mean by the right to the freedom of expression. Human rights are essentially rights that are owed to human beings because they are human beings. So they're elevated in terms of rights in the world of rights. So, for example, because I'm a human being, I'm owed the right to dignity, which means that people can't subject me to torture, people can't arbitrarily deprive me of my liberty. So there are certain rights that are owed to people because they're human beings.
Exactly, and I think today we're going to focus on human rights, but there are so many other rights, as you very clearly mentioned as well. So what are some of the key human rights issues we face in Sri Lanka?
Well, that's a difficult question to answer in the sense that there are so many issues, but right at the top of the list, I would say, would be things like the right to liberty and the right to not be arrested arbitrarily and detained arbitrarily. We also have, at the Human Rights Commission, a number of complaints regarding torture. So I would say torture and cruel, inhuman and degrading treatment is also a problem in Sri Lanka. If I were to pick another right that is extremely important, it would be the freedom of expression. And that's why I would say the radio, for example, is so important, because it's one channel through which people can express themselves.
And also spread awareness.
Absolutely. And so I think freedom of expression is also a right that is often threatened in contexts such as Sri Lanka. And respecting the freedom of expression, respecting media freedom is something that's very important.
Exactly. Speaking of that, I think when you touch on the points of media freedom and expressing freedom, I think we can go on and on.
Absolutely.
But today we're going to focus mainly on human rights and also the challenges the defenders face in Sri Lanka. Now, you did mention about the specific human rights which concern Sri Lanka, but what about the challenges the defenders face?
Yeah, so human rights defenders are really important in a system that respects and protects and promotes human rights, because these are individuals who dedicate their lives to the promotion of human rights. And human rights defenders come in all kinds of forms. They can be activists, they can be members of institutions like NGOs, they can be part of even the state apparatus, right? So they can be officers of the Human Rights Commission, for example. And as the Commission, we have received a lot of concerns and complaints from human rights defenders that the space to promote human rights is often constrained. So recently we in fact released a set of draft guidelines and recommendations on the protection of human rights defenders. And hopefully various stakeholders will see these guidelines and offer their feedback so we can finalize them. And in these guidelines, we have set out some of the challenges that human rights defenders face in the country, and also some of the rights that need to be respected. So again, freedom of expression is a very important right for human rights defenders, because that's the means through which they raise human rights issues in the country. Then, of course, they have the right not to be subject to, torture, arrested. They have the freedom of movement, the freedom to, peacefully assemble and even organize peaceful dissent and protest. So all of these rights that we talk about in terms of human rights are also owed to human rights defenders. And it's through this network of individuals that we can sort of build a culture in which human rights are respected in a country.
And they also focus a lot on safety, isn't it?
Absolutely. I mean, the safety of individuals is absolutely paramount. And that's where law enforcement is very important. So law enforcement obviously has a role in enforcing the law, but essentially the reason that we have law enforcement is for the safety of citizens. So I think human rights defenders play an important part in holding law enforcement to account so that primary objective of safety can actually be achieved while respecting human rights.
So to become a human rights defender, you are supposed to know the human rights laws.
I think so. I mean, you have to be familiar with the human rights system and framework. But often human rights defenders will focus on specific rights. So you have human rights defenders who might focus on the freedom of expression. You might have human rights defenders focusing on women's rights, child rights, the rights of the LGBTIQ community. So you might have also human rights defenders that have specific thematic focuses. So that's another part of the sort of framework of being a human rights defender.
And speaking of human rights, it has changed over time as well. I mean, people have evolved and then situations have changed. So let's talk about how a government incorporates all the changes and how do they come to a specific conclusion that this should be included, this should be removed?
Sure, that's a really good question. So a government will have three types of obligations when it comes to human rights. First and foremost, the government has the obligation or the duty, we spoke about duties earlier, duty to respect rights. That means the government needs to be able to tell the people that the government's actions will not harm human rights. So the duty of respect is the first and foremost duty. Apart from that, the government also has the duty to protect human rights. So it's not enough just to respect human rights. Sometimes your rights might be violated by ordinary citizens or third parties. And the government has a role to protect you from the violations that other parties might inflict on you. So for example, when we talk about law enforcement has a duty to protect you and safeguard you from violations by others. So the duty to protect is the second duty. Then also there is a duty to promote human rights. That means the government has a duty to create a culture in society that respects and protects human rights. And that means human rights need to be also promoted. And here's where I think a lot of work can be done. Because if you look at our school curriculum, you don't really have enough discussion on human rights, and you don't have children actually learning about human rights from a young age, so they grow up to be part of a culture of human rights. Because it's very difficult sometimes to convince adults about the importance of human rights.
It's difficult to unlearn, I guess.
Absolutely. So I think that's why it's important to create a culture from the very beginning where people recognize that, our Constitution has a chapter that's dedicated to fundamental rights. And I don't think enough is being done to teach children about that. So promotion and raising awareness is another big obligation that the government has. And I think education reform is something that can be looked at.
Exactly, and I think we have a lot more to talk about human rights and also what the government can do to improve this. As you very correctly mentioned, that there are a few things which could be done in terms of improving the knowledge of human rights among the general public as well. So before we move on to more questions, I think we can move on to some music as well. So here's Tears for Fears with Everybody Wants to Rule the World, and I don't know, for some reason this kind of connects with what we are speaking about, so let's enjoy the track.
Music feels just so good when you're tuned in to your one and only station
on 97.4 and 97.6 FM.
We're on the hunt for exceptional English original songs to grace our airwaves. If you're an aspiring artist, we want to hear from you. Send us your finest creations to slbc.ad.net@gmail.com or call our hotline 0112 696 452. Send us your originals today and let the magic unfold.
You're listening to Radio Sri Lanka, and we're in conversation with Dr. Gehan, and we've been talking about human rights. And Doctor, you did mention about how children should be taught human rights, even at school. So speaking of the school curriculum, what do you think we should do about, bringing in more practical life lessons into the school curriculum?
Yeah, I mean, if you think about, when you and I went to school, you recall what a focus there was on, preparing for exams.
Exactly.
Right? and the entire school life was built around exams. And I think that's part and parcel of our experience in the education system. But I think if you look at a lot of countries that have more advanced systems of education, there's a shift away from that, and a shift away towards preparing children for adult life. And that's where I think you're hitting the nail on the head in terms of values and ethics and of course rights. I think it's very difficult to shape these things when you become an adult. The building blocks are obviously when you're a child. So it's so important that the education system integrates values education, ethics, civics, and of course human rights into the system. So some of these ideas become absorbed as children, and then in adulthood there's more familiarity with these ideas, because you can't build a culture that respects rights by just raising awareness amongst adults. So I think one of the things that the Human Rights Commission would be very interested in promoting is education. Of course, you can't overload children with very difficult, complicated, complex ideas. They have to be age appropriate. But I think some focus on building values around human rights at a young age is really important. And if you do that, you won't see the results immediately. The results will start to show in a generation's time. And I think that's really important to also understand, that if you want quick results, this is not the way to do it. I think the long-term plan is very important, intergenerational sort of plan to change culture. And it's possible to do. I think over time, if there is a concerted effort, and if governments, and I use the plural there because there's obviously change of governments, and policies have to be sustained by successive governments for
exactly.
it to work.
If it keeps changing, it'll be a problem.
Absolutely. So we have to have a education policy that all governments, all political parties are committed to.
A common one.
A common one. Mm-hmm. And I think that's very important.
And tell us also about some of the steps Sri Lankan government can take in terms of improving human rights. You mentioned about maybe bringing in values into the school education system. So what are the steps the government can take in terms of improving the human rights record?
So I really do think that the promotion of human rights is important. But let's go back to the first duty I spoke about, the duty to respect human rights. So essentially the government sets the tone, because when you talk about human rights, the main duty bearer is the government, is the state. So therefore, when the state violates human rights, that really sets the tone for the entire human rights system and the culture. So I think there is much more to be done in terms of respecting human rights. If you look at, even the recent operation, the Yuktiya operation, lots of institutions, including the Bar Association of Sri Lanka, has raised concerns about whether this operation is continuing while protecting and respecting human rights. So it's certainly a very tough topic. And a subject to discuss at 7:30 in the morning. But I do think that one of the important things that the government has to do is to understand that it sets the tone. So when it launches operations that are, of course, important for society. I mean, if you're dealing with drug trafficking and organized crime, those are important objectives. But doing so in a manner that respects fundamental rights is very important in terms of building that culture. Because at the end of the day, we have to remember that human rights are for all human beings.
Criminals are humans too.
Suspects, accused, criminals, they're also human beings. And the real test in terms of human rights in any society comes down to how we treat those individuals. Because it's very easy to respect the human rights of a law-abiding citizen who's a model, person within society. It's very easy because that person might not really challenge the status quo or challenge systems. But it's much more difficult to respect the human rights of a dissenting figure, or even a figure who breaks the rules, like a criminal suspect. And I think that's where societies need to be really concerned about human rights, because that's the real test. Because if you can respect the human rights of people who break the rules, that's the real value of human rights. So even a suspect, even a criminal, even someone accused of a crime is owed human rights.
And deserves to be protected.
Yeah, absolutely.
Exactly. So speaking of coming to a common, set of human right laws and regulations. I mean, we mentioned about governments when it comes to having a common education system. So this applies to human rights too, isn't it?
To an extent, I think having a common set of values or a common framework is important. And you start with, I think, at the international level with the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. I think that's a good starting point, because that's the common understanding across the world in terms of what our human rights might be. At the local level, we have, of course, the Fundamental Rights chapter of the Constitution, which is very much based on at least the civil and political rights element of the Universal Declaration. So that's, again, an important common framework. But even beyond that, there are, social and economic rights, like the right to education, which has been recognized for a very long time in Sri Lanka. You have the right to health, which is such an important right in the Sri Lankan context. You have the right to housing. So there are all kinds of socio-economic rights that are also recognized in the Universal Declaration, but not necessarily recognized as fundamental rights in our Constitution, which also need to be respected, protected, and promoted.
Right, so we'll be talking more about this right after some messages and music. You're listening to Radio Sri Lanka. It's a coffee hour. It's precisely 7:35.
You're with Radio Sri Lanka on 97.4 and 97.6 FM.
This is my only favorite station, playing the best songs on the radio.
Drink Siddhalepa Lakphayava twice a day to boost your immunity. No chemicals and sugar added.
In order for you to invoke blessings upon your family and the nation at large, with the sponsoring of the delivery of the sermon by the Mahasangha on the airwaves of National Radio, get in touch with us to be a part of this meritorious deed by calling us on 0112 696 271 on weekdays between 9 and 3. The meritorious contribution for the Dharma exceeds all other meritorious deeds.
You're listening to Radio Sri Lanka. That was a beautiful rendition of Fire by Babyface and Desiree. It's precisely 7:39. We are in conversation with Dr. Gehan, and he is the Commissioner at the Human Rights Commission of Sri Lanka and a Research Fellow at the University of Oxford. And Doctor, we've been talking a lot about the government's responsibilities in terms of protecting human rights, and you spoke a lot about respect as well. So let's also touch on the individual's responsibilities in respecting every human being.
Yeah, absolutely. So I think if you go down to why we place obligations on the government to respect and protect human rights is because governments wield power and influence. And it's natural, if you want to build a society that respects human rights, to place obligations on those who are powerful. But also, societies evolve. And those who wield power can also be non-governmental figures. It can be private individuals, it can be corporations, private companies. And they also wield enormous power and influence. And in a modern setting, it makes sense to actually also recognize the obligations of those non-state actors to respect human rights. And I mean, if you take an example, if you look at environmental rights, a lot of environmental rights are violated not by government. Of course, you might have government violations, but also by private companies engaging in development projects around the world. You have multinational corporations that
it's not only just Sri Lanka,
absolutely,
but it happens world over.
World over, particularly when it comes to things like pollution and waste. You do have the violation of those rights, and it's important that human rights are recognized as things that also apply to non-state actors. In Sri Lanka, I think when you think about rights, we also have to talk very seriously about labor rights. And that's where, private companies and private, employers also have obligations. So if you think about the whole International Labour Organization framework, the ILO framework, those rights don't apply just to the state. It applies to, the private sector as well. So individuals also owe each other certain duties. And in a modern setting, I think it's important to recognize that human rights are not just between citizens and the state. It's also horizontal, if you were to use that word, not just vertical, horizontal in the sense that citizens owe each other certain duties as well.
I think, yes, as you very correctly mentioned, every individual plays a role, and they have to actually act responsibly with respect to each and everybody. And it's not just about what the state tells you to do, but you have your common sense too.
Absolutely. And I think going back to some of the points we raised earlier, that's important in terms of the education system, to instill that respect. And then again, going back to an earlier point, the government needs to set the tone and be an example there. And I think that's how you build a culture, and that culture can't be built, overnight. It'll take a generation. It'll take 2 generations. Yeah.
Exactly. And speaking of human rights itself, it's a very vast topic. So, I mean, everything relates to human rights. Now, when you talk about animal rights, it's about how we respect the animals and what we can do as humans, because obviously we are the ones who are acting upon it. Yep. So when it comes to labor rights, once again, the human rights also plays a role. Correct me if I'm wrong. So it plays a role in terms of protecting individuals who work.
Yeah.
So I think it's a very complicated situation where you have to bring everything together and make things work in a proper way.
Yeah.
So where can an individual find out what their rights are, and also to get to know more details about it? And I mean, I understand you mentioned that it should be put into a person when they are young, and it's a little difficult to teach them when they are grown-ups, but we still have a way to learn, isn't it?
Sure. I mean, if you want to learn about what your rights are, I think the Human Rights Commission, for example, plays a role in promoting education and awareness about rights. So, for example, our website will have information. But also, rights are something that are natural. A lot of people already know because they have an instinct about what their rights are. And that's a natural thing.
Some of them are just put on paper, but we know it.
Yeah, we know. We have a sense of what our rights are, because whenever, say, for example, someone will, prevent you from leaving a room, sort of manhandling you, or arresting you, or holding you, to ransom, you have an immediate sense that, this is wrong, because you have a sense that you have a right to your liberty. Right? So no one needs to even articulate that for you. There's already an innate, natural sense that we have the right to be free. And that's why the world over, even where societies were subjugated or placed under pressure by another, invading force, people resist because there's this natural sense that we have the freedom, we have the right to that freedom. So I think on the one hand, you can check out what your rights are. You can go to, resources like the Human Rights Commission website or other resources.
ILO, as you mentioned, for labor.
But there's also this innate sense, that inherent sense of knowing what your rights are.
Exactly, and I think, as you mentioned, that this common sense and also your instincts.
Absolutely.
And you know when it's right and when it's wrong. And sometimes some people just need to see it written on a piece of paper.
Yeah.
It's like giving consent for marriage.
I think that confirmation that you have rights is important, which is why we spoke about education, right? Children may have a instinct that there are certain things that are owed to them, but I think you need to reinforce that through the education system. So you build a culture in which people recognize that they have rights, but also recognize the rights of others so they can respect those rights. So it's a two-way street. It's not just about my rights and me. It's also about, the other person's rights and what I can do to respect those rights.
And you also mentioned about how pollution can play a role in terms of violating human rights and, many things. So I guess we contribute to a certain extent as individuals.
Take noise pollution, for example. I mean, even the simple thing of not honking your horns next to a hospital. Or at a time of day when people are sleeping, that depicts a culture in which we respect each other and respect the rights of each other. So even simple things like that are good indicators as to whether we live in a society that respects rights. I think it's a everyday thing rather than something that is very complex and very sophisticated. Human rights come down to everyday living, and I think that's very important to understand.
As a final, Doctor, can we also touch on the positive developments on human rights in Sri Lanka for the year 2024, 2023? Obviously, we are just done with 2023, but we have to make the positive changes in that year for us to be able to follow it this year.
Sure. I think one of the big success stories in Sri Lanka when it comes to rights is the right to information. That's something that we have to, recognize and celebrate as a great triumph, because for a long time there were campaigners that wanted the right to information to be recognized, and back in 2015 the Constitution was amended to recognize the right to information, and then a year later we had a historic act, the Right to Information Act. And I must say we have a great Right to Information Commission that has done important work over the last 7 years.
It's also spread across every district, isn't it?
Absolutely. That has really created a new culture in which people recognize that they have the right to information. The number of right to information requests that even the Human Rights Commission receives on various issues is really, really telling in terms of how this culture has evolved. So I think that's one of the positive stories in Sri Lanka, that we really do have this now understanding and use of a new right. And quietly, I think even state institutions have evolved over the last 7 years to respect this right. Of course, there's a long way to go, and I think it's too early to say that, we have
established and everything's fine.
We've established the right to information in a way that there's no more need to improve. There's certainly a lot of room to improve. But I must say that, the Human Rights Commission receives lots of right to information requests because, there is this understanding and awareness about the right to information. And that's all down to this new law and the important work that civil society, of course, has done. And also, I must acknowledge the Right to Information Commission. It's done a fabulous job.
Thank you very much, Dr. Gehan Gunatilleke, for all that very informative talk and chat we had from 7 in the morning. So
My pleasure.
It has been an absolute pleasure and very enlightening as well. Thank you very much.
Thank you for having me.
And have yourself a great day ahead. You're listening to Radio Sri Lanka, 10 minutes to 8, and that was Coffee Hour. We continue with more music. It's a beautiful morning. You're listening to Radio Sri Lanka.